What started as a peaceful day of mushroom hunting quickly turned into a chilling mystery that still haunts everyone involved. Are you ready to uncover the dark secrets of La Musara? If you like unbelievable but true stories and the mystery of dark mysteries, you're in the right place. Here's today's story. It was the afternoon of October 16, 1991, and 36-year-old Enrique Martinez crouched down beside a moss-covered log, flicked open his pocket knife, and carefully cut the stem of a mushroom. He inspected it briefly before tossing it into his wicker basket, already brimming with other fungi he'd collected. Standing up, Enrique paused to soak in the view. A green valley so vibrant it almost looked otherworldly, sprawling out beneath him like something straight out of a postcard. For a moment, he forgot why he was even here. The peace and quiet were intoxicating. Enrique wasn't alone on this little adventure. His wife, Ana, was nearby, along with their friends Jorge and Sofia, a couple who were still in that honeymoon phase of dating where everything feels picture-perfect. The four of them were wandering through the mountains of northeastern Spain, hunting for mushrooms near an eerie abandoned town called La Musara. Now, this wasn't just any run-of-the-mill ghost town. La Musara had a reputation, a creepy one. Jorge, the unofficial ringleader of the group, was the one who had suggested coming here. He had heard all sorts of bizarre, spine-tingling stories about the place, haunted ruins, strange disappearances, and folklore that would make your hair stand on end. Naturally, Jorge thought it sounded like a fantastic day trip. But Enrique? He couldn't care less about haunted towns or ghost stories. Frankly, he thought the whole thing was a little ridiculous. What did excite him, though, was the mushrooms. Enrique had a passion for foraging, and the idea of spending the day immersed in nature, far away from the noise and chaos of his hometown of Tarragona, was all the motivation he needed. Tarragona was a busy port city where Enrique worked as a bartender, slinging drinks for rowdy crowds night after night. The thought of standing in silence, under a canopy of trees, hunting for the perfect mushroom? That was practically heaven. Today's mission was simple. Enrique had his sights set on a specific prize, the bloody milk-cap mushroom. Weird name, sure, but it lived up to the hype. These mushrooms weren't just edible, they were delicious, especially grilled and served alongside meat. Enrique's plan? Gather enough to cook an epic feast for his wife and friends once they got back. As the group made their way uphill, the landscape began to change. The lush greenery gave way to something older. Crumbling ruins started to emerge from the brush, their jagged edges silhouetted against the sky. They had arrived at La Musara, a town that had stood for over 900 years. Now it was barely more than a skeleton of what it once was. Ancient, decaying stone structures, some of which dated back to prehistoric times. The air around them grew heavy, like the ruins themselves were watching, waiting. And as they stepped closer, it became clear. This wasn't just a forgotten town. This place felt different, and not in a good way. La Musara was never exactly bustling. At its height, the town had maybe 300 residents, tops, but that was a long time ago. The last of its people packed up and left about 40 years earlier, leaving behind a skeleton of what once was a true ghost town. Now it was nothing more than crumbling ruins and eerie silence. The group wandered over to the outskirts of the town, stopping at what was left of one of the buildings. It was barely standing. A stone foundation with 3 jagged walls reaching up like broken teeth. No roof, no charm, just decay. From this spot, though, they had a perfect view of La Musara's main road. It stretched straight ahead, a dirt path flanked on both sides by the remains of other buildings, their foundations barely clinging to existence. About 200 feet down the road stood what was unmistakably the centerpiece of the town, an old church. Unlike the rest of La Musara, the church hadn't fully given in to time. Sure, it looked weathered, but its tall steeple still reached defiantly toward the sky, as if refusing to crumble like everything else around it. Behind the church, they could just make out an overgrown cemetery, its tombstones peeking out from the wild grass. To the side of the church there was a murky pond, half hidden by weeds and buzzing with the sound of croaking frogs. For a moment, the group just stood there next to the ruined building, staring at the desolate scene. No one said a word. It's not that they were shocked. After all, they knew this place had a reputation for being creepy. Jorge, in particular, had been hyping it up as a haunted hotspot, practically dragging them here for that exact reason. But standing there now, seeing it with their own eyes, the atmosphere was heavier, darker. The air itself seemed charged, like the place didn't want them there. And then, as if on cue, a mist started to roll in, almost theatrically. At first it was just a thin veil, but it crept forward with purpose, swallowing the dirt road and licking at the ruins. Jorge had mentioned this. He'd read somewhere that La Musara was famous for its mist, which supposedly blanketed the entire area at night. The thing was, it wasn't even close to nighttime yet. This was happening in broad daylight. Finally breaking the silence, Jorge grinned like a kid with a secret and said, "Hey, I want to show you something." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Sofia's hand and started jogging toward the church. Naturally, Enrique and Ana followed, though at a slower pace. They'd barely gone 10 or 20 feet when Enrique instinctively turned around to glance back at the building they'd just left. And just like that, it was gone. Completely swallowed by the fog. One second it was there, the next it was like it had never existed. Enrique stopped dead in his tracks, his stomach doing a little flip. He wasn't one to get spooked easily, but this? Yeah, this was unsettling. Enrique couldn't shake this nagging feeling as the fog wrapped around them like a damp blanket. This wasn't right. Jorge said the mist was a nighttime thing, but here it was, swallowing them whole in broad daylight. He tried to brush it off, maybe it was just his nerves, and turned back to catch up with the others. Jorge and Sofia had stopped just ahead, standing near this odd rectangular rock that jutted out of the ground like some ancient marker no one had bothered to remove. It was about 2 feet tall, weathered, and completely out of place. When Enrique and Ana reached them, Jorge had this smug grin plastered on his face as he placed his hand firmly on top of the rock, like it was some prize he'd just discovered. "This," Jorge said dramatically, "is the Sith Stone. People say it holds dark powers." He paused for effect, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Jorge went on to explain the stone's eerie backstory. Apparently, it was one of the oldest relics in La Musara, dating back to when Muslim armies marched through the area. Fun fact, the name La Musara actually means the place to march. These armies believed the Sith Stone wasn't just a weird rock sticking out of the dirt. It was magical. They'd stop here, touch it, and pray for power to crush their enemies in upcoming battles. Of course, the armies were long gone, but the legend of the Sith Stone stuck around. People claimed it still had those dark, mysterious powers. Some even whispered that if you touched it, you might get sucked into a parallel world teeming with demonic entities. You know, just casual Sunday folklore. And while Jorge was happily rattling off this ominous history, his hand stayed glued to the stone the entire time, because apparently irony was his thing. When he finished, he turned to the group with a mischievous grin. "Come on, someone else touch it," he challenged. Sofia immediately backed away. "Nope, absolutely not. I like my soul where it is, thanks," she said, crossing her arms. But Ana, ever the adventurous spirit, stepped forward. "Fine, I'll do it," she said, rolling her eyes at the theatrics. Jorge beamed, pulling his hand from the stone like he was revealing the Holy Grail. Ana approached the Sith Stone, took a deep breath and placed her hand on it. For a second, the group froze, their collective breath held, half expecting the ground to split open or some shadowy hand to drag Ana into the abyss. But nothing happened. No lightning strikes, no wailing ghosts, just Ana standing there, looking slightly disappointed. A few seconds later, she stepped back, laughing nervously, and the group joined in. But then, mid-laugh, Enrique stiffened. Something wasn't right. The frogs in the pond near the church, barely noticeable a moment ago, were suddenly deafening. Their croaks echoed through the fog-covered ruins, an unnatural, almost aggressive volume, as if the stone had cranked nature's dial to 11. Enrique's smile faded. What had just happened? Enrique froze, his eyes locked on the foggy outline of the pond in the distance. The frogs' croaking had become deafening, like someone had cranked up the volume on nature itself. He squinted, trying to figure out what had set them off. And then, just beyond the pond, through the mist, he caught a glimpse of the old, crumbling church. Its jagged silhouette stood like a ghostly monument to the past. For a moment, the fog swirled and thinned, and that's when Enrique saw it. A figure. A dark, shadowy figure standing perfectly still in one of the broken windows, staring directly at him and his friends. His stomach dropped. It wasn't moving. It wasn't shifting. It was just there, watching. And then, just as quickly as the fog had parted, it rolled back in like a thick curtain, swallowing the church and the figure whole. The window disappeared into the gray haze, leaving Enrique staring at nothing but mist. He blinked hard, his mind racing. Did he just imagine that? Or did he really see something? For a moment he stood there, stunned, trying to wrap his head around what just happened. But before he could even begin to process it, he heard his wife's voice. "Enrique, come on, touch the stone too," Ana called out, laughing, completely unaware of the eerie sight her husband had just witnessed. Enrique turned back to his group, forcing himself to shake it off. He scanned their faces, Ana, Sofia, Jorge, all still grinning, joking around. Clearly, none of them had seen what he saw, or what he thought he saw. He glanced over his shoulder again, back toward the church. But the fog was thick now, completely obscuring the window and whatever, or whoever, had been there. His heart was pounding. It was probably nothing, he thought. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Taking a deep breath, Enrique plastered on a smile and stepped back toward his friends. All right, he said with a nervous chuckle, trying to brush it off. Let's see what all the fuss is about with this rock. But deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he saw, or thought he saw, was anything but his imagination. So Enrique turned back to his friends who were now giving him that look. You know the one. The, "we're not letting this go until you do it," look. Realizing there was no way out, he sighed dramatically, muttered a reluctant, "Fine," and stepped up to the infamous stone. With a final glance at the fog-covered church, he reached out and placed his hand on the stone. Instantly, everything shifted. The air around him felt colder, like someone had flipped a switch, and yet the stone under his hand was getting warmer, almost unnervingly so. But here's the weird part. Instead of pulling away like any rational person might, Enrique felt hooked. The sensation was strangely calming, almost mesmerizing. He found himself thinking, I could stand here forever, just like this. This is incredible. It was as though the stone was whispering to him, coaxing him to stay. But then, like a bolt of lightning cutting through a stormy sky, some deep instinct buried in his mind screamed at him, "Let go, get away, now." It wasn't a gentle nudge, it was a primal, gut-level warning. So, with a sharp gasp, Enrique yanked his hand back as if the stone had suddenly burned him. And just like that, everything snapped back to normal. The air felt ordinary again, the pull of the stone vanished, and Enrique was left standing there, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As he turned toward the group, Ana and Jorge were grinning ear to ear, clearly waiting for him to spill the details. "Well, what was it like?" Ana asked, her voice teasing. But before Enrique could answer, Sofia, Jorge's girlfriend, who had been hanging back this whole time, cut in. And she was not smiling. She crossed her arms and shot a nervous glance at the stone. "Guys," she said firmly, "let's just get away from this thing. I don't want to tempt, evil spirits or whatever. Let's go." Jorge, ever the jokester, slung his arm around Sophia and laughed. "Evil spirits? Come on, Sophia, it's just a rock. Lighten up." He gave her hand a tug and started leading her down the misty road, straight toward the ominous silhouette of the church. Anna, practically bouncing with excitement, quickly ran after them like a kid chasing an adventure she couldn't wait to dive into. Enrique hesitated for a second, his eyes flicking back toward the stone, then toward the fog-covered window of the church. Something about this whole situation felt off. But with a shake of his head, he pushed the thought aside and hurried to catch up with the group. But Enrique hesitated, lingering behind while the others moved ahead. There was something about that stone, something he couldn't shake. Sure, he had convinced himself that whatever he saw in the church window was just a trick of the light or his imagination, but touching the cyst stone, that had been different. It wasn't just strange. It felt wrong, like the energy of the entire village had shifted the moment his hand made contact. Now, as he stood there, surrounded by thick fog that seemed to swallow La Musara whole, he couldn't help but feel like the village itself was watching him. He couldn't explain it, but it was a sensation that crawled under his skin and wouldn't let go. Despite this growing unease, Enrique didn't want to be the guy who ruined the fun, especially not for Anna. So, swallowing his discomfort, he forced himself to keep walking, catching up to the group as they disappeared further down the misty road. Step by step, the fog began to thin just enough for Enrique to spot the pond again, the one teeming with frogs that croaked in a deafening, almost rhythmic chorus. Beyond it was the church, looming like a shadowy skeleton of its former self. He instinctively glanced at the window, the same one where he had seen that dark figure earlier. Empty. Thank God. And then he noticed his friends. They hadn't stopped at the church, and to Enrique's relief, they hadn't tried to go inside either. Instead, they had wandered behind the building, into the old cemetery. A flicker of relief washed over him, until he realized he would have to pass the church himself to catch up. He tried to convince himself that it was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But as he edged closer, something shifted inside him. It was subtle at first, like a whisper at the back of his mind, but it grew louder with every step. And then, without even thinking about it, Enrique stopped, dead in his tracks. It was the window. His eyes locked onto it again. It was empty, just like before, but this time he couldn't move past it. There was something about that window, not just the faint memory of the figure he had seen, but something else. It felt alive, like it was pulling him, urging him to come closer. He told himself to just keep walking, to follow his friends, but his feet wouldn't listen. Against all logic, Enrique found himself stepping off the path and walking straight toward it. By the time he reached the window, the world around him seemed to quiet, as if the fog had swallowed all sound, even the frogs. He stood there, inches from the glass, staring inside the ruined church. The interior was a decayed shell of what it once was. Broken pews were scattered across the floor like forgotten bones, and the pulpit, where the priest would have once stood, was little more than a jagged shadow. And yet, despite the emptiness, Enrique couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Something was there, watching him, waiting. So there's Enrique, standing frozen in front of this shattered church window. He's leaning in, almost like something on the other side is calling to him. Not audibly, but it's like magnetic. He keeps inching closer, closer, until it feels like he's not even in control anymore. And then, out of nowhere, the sound of the frogs from the pond behind him starts to swell. These obnoxious croaks grow louder and louder, to the point where it's not just background noise anymore. It's overwhelming, like the whole world is just frogs. And Enrique? He's stuck, completely consumed by this bizarre moment. Meanwhile, around the back of the church, Ana, Jorge, and Sofia are casually strolling through the cemetery like they're on a leisurely Sunday walk. They're chuckling, reading the headstones, probably making jokes about how old some of the graves are. You know, the way people do when they're trying to make light of a creepy situation. But then Ana, who's Enrique's wife, suddenly notices something. She looks up and realizes Enrique's not with them. She wanders over to the rusted cemetery gate and scans the side of the church. That's when she spots him. There's Enrique, just standing there, leaning into the window like he's hypnotized or something. It's weird enough to make her stop in her tracks. So she yells out to him, "Enrique, hey, what are you doing?" But nothing. He doesn't even flinch. He's still staring into the church, completely unresponsive. At this point, Anna's a little freaked out, so she walks over to him. She calls his name again, louder this time, but still, no reaction. Finally, she grabs his shoulder and gives him a good shake. And that did it. Enrique snaps out of whatever trance he was in and looks at her. But the look on his face? It's like he has no idea where he is or what's even happening. He doesn't say a word, just stares at her, totally confused. Anna, trying to shake off the weirdness, just gives him this look like, okay then, and says, "Come on, everyone's in the cemetery. Stop being weird." She turns and skips back to the others, like nothing out of the ordinary just happened. Once she's back with Jorge and Sofia, she dives right back into reading the headstones, as though her husband wasn't just caught in some bizarre, frog-filled trance at a haunted church window. Classic Anna. So, as Anna stepped back to get a better view of a particular headstone, she didn't realize that she was leaning into another one. A large cross etched with a strange line across its surface. And before she could stop herself, she bumped into it. The cross wobbled, tipped forward, and then, crack, it toppled to the ground, breaking clean in half. The sound echoed through the empty cemetery like a gunshot, and all three of them froze. Jorge and Sofia whipped around to see Anna standing over the shattered grave marker, her face drained of color. Jorge, ever the comedian, immediately burst into laughter. "Oh no, Anna," he said, barely able to get the words out between chuckles. "You've done it now. You've just ticked off the evil spirits of this town. Better fix that before they come for you." Anna tried to laugh it off, but her nervous smile betrayed her panic. Her hands flew to the broken pieces, trying desperately to fit them back together like some macabre jigsaw puzzle, but it was no use. The headstone was completely ruined. Jorge, meanwhile, was thoroughly enjoying himself, tossing out sarcastic warnings about vengeful spirits and curses as Anna frantically fumbled with the broken stone. Sofia, however, wasn't laughing. She stood next to Jorge, her eyes shifting uneasily between Anna and the dark, looming church in the distance. "Jorge," she said, her voice dropping just above a whisper. "Is it true? Is this place haunted? For real? Like, what's the story with this town?" At this, Jorge's grin faded, and he turned to Sofia with a more serious expression. "Yeah," he said, his tone dropping. "I mean, people say it is. Want to know why?" He glanced at Anna, who had finally given up on repairing the headstone and now stood frozen, staring back at him. Jorge took a deep breath before launching into the tale. Okay, so back in October of 1873, there was a civil war raging in this part of Spain. One of the armies used the caves in the mountains nearby as makeshift field hospitals, and one night a famous general, General Kirkos, was brought into one of those caves after being wounded in battle. He didn't make it. He died there. He paused for effect, watching Sofia and Anna's faces as the weight of the story began to sink in. Now, Kirkos wasn't just any leader. He was a beloved general. His men looked up to him, and his death? It would have crushed their morale. So the 6 soldiers who were with him decided to keep it a secret. They made a coffin for him right there in the cave and carried it to La Musara under the cover of darkness. They buried him in this very cemetery, behind that creepy old church. He gestured toward the church, its shadow stretching long in the moonlight. But here's the thing, Jorge continued, leaning in for dramatic effect. They say those soldiers didn't just bury Kerkos. They buried something else with him. Something they didn't want anyone to find. At this point, Sophia's eyes were wide, and even Anna, who had been on edge since breaking the headstone, couldn't help but lean in. Jorge smirked, clearly enjoying their reactions. And ever since that night, weird things have been happening around La Musara. People disappearing, strange noises, you name it. They say Cercos doesn't rest easy here. And now, Anna, he added with a sly grin, you've just gone and disturbed him. Anna let out a nervous laugh, but the chill running down her spine wasn't so easy to shake. And as the 3 of them stood there, the wind seemed to pick up, rustling the trees and carrying with it the faintest sound, like a low guttural croak, coming from the direction of the church. Weeks later, 5 armed soldiers, enemies of Kerkos's army, climbed the steep rocky path into La Musara. Now, here's the thing. These guys had no idea Kerkos was dead. The only people who knew were the 6 who buried him in secret. So these soldiers stormed into the village, convinced Kerkos was hiding out there, maybe plotting his next move. And they were not taking no for an answer. They barged into homes, overturning furniture, tearing through belongings and dragging terrified villagers into the streets. They screamed at them, demanding, "Where is Kerkos?" And if the villagers didn't cooperate. The soldiers made it painfully clear that their lives were on the line. After about an hour of this chaos, the tension boiled over. One elderly man, trembling but clearly fed up, stepped forward. He raised his hand and said, "Enough. Cercos is dead. He's buried in the cemetery behind the church." Now you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Wrong. The soldiers didn't believe him. They sneered, "Oh yeah? Prove it." But the old man shook his head and admitted he didn't know the exact grave. He had only heard about the secret burial. The soldiers weren't about to let this go. Their leader barked, "Fine, get everyone to the cemetery. Now." So, with no choice, the entire village shuffled toward the cemetery, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. The soldiers followed close behind, their weapons ready. Once there, the soldiers issued their next command. "Start digging, all of you. Find him." And so, under the watchful eyes of their captors, the townspeople began the grim task of digging up graves one by one. But as shovels hit the earth, something eerie started to happen. The frogs, yes, frogs, from the nearby pond began croaking. At first, it was just background noise, but it grew louder, and louder, and louder. Until it was deafening, like the whole pond was alive with panic. The leader of the soldiers snapped. He stormed over to the pond, gun drawn, and started firing into the water. Pop, pop, pop. But the frogs didn't care. If anything, they only seemed to get louder, like they were mocking him. Frustrated and defeated, the leader finally gave up and stomped back to the cemetery. When he returned, he stopped dead in his tracks. The villagers had stopped digging. They'd uncovered every grave they could find, but there was no Kerkos, just holes and headstones. And yet, as the leader scanned the graveyard, one plot stood out. It was untouched, pristine. Every other grave had been clawed open, but no one had dared to touch this one. It was almost like the ground itself was warning them to stay away. The leader pointed at it, his face twisting with suspicion. "Dig that one," he growled. And just like that, every eye in the cemetery turned toward the mysterious grave. But the moment the leader barked his order to dig up that untouched grave, the townspeople immediately recoiled, shuffling back like he'd just told them to put their hands in a fire. Their fear was palpable. Finally, one brave soul stepped forward, his voice trembling, and tried to explain. That grave belonged to an old woman who had passed away recently. And, well, everyone in La Musara believed she was a witch. Digging her up? Bad idea. Dangerous idea. Don't mess with that kind of idea. But the rival soldiers? Zero sympathy, zero belief in the supernatural, and zero patience. They raised their guns, barking a single warning: dig. Now. And so, reluctantly, with muttered prayers and nervous glances, the townspeople unearthed the coffin. When the soldiers pried it open, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. The chaotic energy of the digging vanished, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Inside the coffin lay the old woman, but something wasn't right. She looked untouched by death. Her skin was pale, sure, but unblemished, as if she'd been resting instead of rotting. Her cheeks still had a faint blush, her lips slightly parted like she'd been mid-sentence when she passed. But the worst part? Her eyes, wide open, staring straight at the crowd, unblinking, unseeing, or maybe seeing too much. The townspeople froze, then erupted into chaos. Some screamed, others sobbed, and most scrambled back from the grave like it might swallow them whole. Even the soldiers, who had been all bravado and guns, faltered. But their fear quickly turned into anger. They hadn't found their general, and now they were stuck with this, whatever this was. Frustrated and spooked, the soldiers yanked her body from the coffin, dragged it to a nearby tree, and hung her there. And then, in a shocking display of rage, or maybe fear, they opened fire. Bullet after bullet tore into the lifeless body until nothing recognizable remained. And then, silence. Not just among the soldiers and townspeople, but everywhere. The frogs, whose relentless croaking had been an almost maddening backdrop all night, had stopped. Not quieted. Stopped. Completely. The air felt heavy, like the whole town was holding its breath. The unsettling stillness was too much for the soldiers. Without a word, they turned and fled, their boots pounding against the ground as they disappeared into the darkness. The townspeople, still trembling with fear and grief, began the grim task of restoring order to their desecrated cemetery. But as one man climbed into the witch's grave to begin refilling it, something strange happened. His foot sank deeper, much deeper, than it should. He froze, staring down at the disturbed soil beneath him. Whatever he'd just stepped on, it wasn't dirt. When the townsman's foot sank into the dirt, it didn't just compress the soil beneath it. It crashed into something hollow. Everyone froze. Slowly, the group realized what had happened. Beneath the witch's coffin, there was another one. Hidden, buried deeper. And when they pried it open, their suspicions were confirmed. This was the secret resting place of General Circos. You see, when those 6 loyal followers of Circos had buried him, they'd pulled off a pretty clever trick. Instead of giving him a proper grave, where someone might eventually dig him up, they tucked his coffin at the bottom of a freshly dug grave meant for someone else. They tossed a layer of dirt over it, just enough to hide it. And then, like clockwork, the next day, the townspeople unknowingly lowered the witch's coffin on top of it, sealing his secret forever. No one questioned it. They slapped on a headstone, etched with nothing but a single horizontal line. No name, nothing. The witch's reputation alone was enough to keep anyone from poking around. Or so they thought. But after what happened that day with the soldiers, the desecration of the witch's grave and her brutal destruction, La Musara wasn't just shaken. It was cursed. And not in some vague, bad vibes kind of way either. People started dying unexpectedly. The soil turned sour, crops withered, and then came the insects, swarming in droves. Diseases spread like wildfire, plagues ravaged the population, and before long the town fell into ruin. By the 1950s, the last few families had packed up and left, leaving La Musara to rot, an official ghost town, its curse burning brightly in local legend. Jorge wrapped up his story with a grim look, but Ana wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the ground, pale as a sheet. Because the gravestone she'd accidentally knocked over and broken earlier? Yeah, it had a horizontal line carved through the middle. It was the witch's headstone. Ana felt her stomach twist. She wanted to scream to Jorge and Sofia that they needed to get out of here, right now. But before she could, something caught her eye. Just near the base of the cemetery wall, poking through the mist, was a mushroom. The perfect bloody milk-cap mushroom. The exact type her husband Enrique had been searching for. For a split second, her fear melted away. She hurried over, plucked the mushroom, and turned to show it to Enrique. But he wasn't there. She blinked, scanning the foggy cemetery. Her heart rate spiked. Wait, did Enrique ever actually follow me back into the cemetery? She thought she'd seen him by the church earlier, but now she wasn't so sure. Enrique? She called out, her voice cutting through the eerie silence. No response. Panic bubbled up. She turned to Jorge and Sofia, who were just blurry figures in the fog. Hey, have you seen Enrique? Is he here? Did you see where he went? Both of them shook their heads, looking just as confused as she felt. No idea, Jorge replied. Anna's chest tightened. Something about this place, this whole situation, was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. She didn't even realize she'd dropped the mushroom as she turned and bolted from the cemetery, her panic taking over completely. Jorge and Sofia, still clueless about the storm of fear unraveling inside Anna, exchanged a look and casually followed after her. They didn't get it yet. To them, it was just Anna being a little jumpy. They stepped out of the cemetery, rounding the corner to walk alongside the church. But for Anna, every step away from that cursed graveyard felt like a race against something she couldn't see coming. The fog was relentless, thick, unyielding, and playing tricks on their senses. Sofia and Jorge moved cautiously along the path, their breaths quickening, eyes darting through the mist. They couldn't see Ana or Enrique, but Ana's voice rang out, desperate and strained, as she called for her missing husband. Each time Sofia or Jorge spotted movement, a shadow shifting in the fog, they thought, finally, that must be them. But as they rushed forward, there was nothing, just empty air. The eerie silence of the abandoned town seemed to amplify every misstep, every breath, every creak of the old graveyard gate behind them. Sofia, visibly shaken, clung to Jorge's arm like a lifeline. Jorge, who had spent the earlier part of the trip cracking jokes about La Musara being cursed, wasn't laughing anymore. The unease was sinking in, and both of them found themselves quickening their pace, heading toward Anna's voice with growing urgency. But the fog wasn't the only thing messing with their nerves. As they approached what they thought was Anna's location, a sound began to rise around them. It started faint, but it grew fast. The guttural, almost deafening croaking of frogs from the nearby pond. The noise became so loud, so overwhelming that it seemed to drown out everything else, including Anna's frantic cries. And then, just as quickly as it began, the croaking stopped. Not a single sound remained, except for Anna's muffled sobs cutting through the stillness. Sofia and Jorge strained their eyes, but the fog was so dense, they could only follow the sound of Anna crying. When they finally reached her, she was crouched down, her back to them, right at the spot where they had seen Enrique earlier, staring into the church window. They approached cautiously, Jorge placing a hand on Anna's shoulder. When she turned around, her face was streaked with tears, and in her arms, she clutched Enrique's wicker basket, the same one he had been using to collect mushrooms. She looked up at them, her voice trembling. "He's gone," she whispered. The weight of those two words hit Sofia and Jorge like a punch to the gut. The three of them spent the next hour scouring La Musara for Enrique. They called his name, retraced their steps, wandered through the fog-shrouded streets, but it was no use. The visibility was practically zero, and now night was creeping in, blanketing the cursed town in an even thicker darkness. Heartbroken and terrified, the group finally made a decision. They had no idea where Enrique was, no sign of what had happened to him, and searching any longer seemed futile. Their only option was to leave La Musara and get help from the authorities. But as they turned to go, the air around them felt heavier, as if the town itself was watching, waiting. And deep down, none of them could shake the feeling that whatever had taken Enrique wasn't finished yet. When authorities got involved, they launched a massive search operation around La Musara. For an entire week, search teams combed through the dense fog and rugged terrain, but there wasn't a single trace of Enrique. Not a footprint, not a clue. Nothing. It was like he had just evaporated. The only thing left behind was that wicker basket Anna had found. After exhausting every lead, the search was officially called off. Authorities told Anna as gently as possible that Enrique had probably wandered off, succumbed to the elements, and that, eventually, some hiker would stumble across his body. But Anna? She wasn't buying it. Not for a second. She couldn't accept that conclusion. Her husband didn't just wander off. And so, driven by a mix of love and sheer determination, Anna kept returning to La Musara, searching for him herself. Months passed. Then, in January of 1992, 3 months after Enrique's disappearance, Anna convinced Sofia and Jorge to join her for another search mission. As they retraced their steps through the eerie, fog-soaked ruins, the group found themselves once again near the old, crumbling church. The same church where Enrique had last been seen, staring into that window like he'd been hypnotized. And as they walked past it, something caught their eyes. Through the fogged-up glass, they could just barely make out the inside of the church. And there, right on the main floor, where pews and a pulpit had probably once stood, were 6 dark figures. They were wearing robes, standing in a circle, completely still. At first, Anna was furious. She figured these were just ghost hunters, amateurs looking for a thrill, feeding off the headlines of Enrique's disappearance. After all, his story had been all over the news. The media had latched onto it, calling attention to La Musara's long-standing reputation as a haunted, cursed place. Naturally, it attracted every paranormal enthusiast within 100 miles. And to Anna, this wasn't just disrespectful. It was personal. Her husband wasn't some ghost story. He was her husband. So, without hesitation, Anna stormed up to the window, ready to tell these people off and demand they leave. But just as she was about to shout, one of the robed figures turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Anna. And that's when the blood drained from her face. Because the way it looked at her, it wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even human. And instantly, Anna froze. She stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest, because what she had just seen was not a ghost hunter. The hooded figure that had turned to face her. It didn't have a face, no eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just a deep, endless void where a face should have been, staring straight at her. And yet, somehow, she could feel it watching her, as if that dark emptiness was locking onto her very soul. Before Anna or the others could even process what they were seeing, they were jolted by a sudden, deafening noise behind them. The sound of galloping, like an entire herd of horses barreling straight toward them. It was so loud the ground seemed to tremble under their feet. At the same time, the frogs from the nearby pond, which had been croaking faintly in the background, suddenly erupted into a chaotic cacophony, their chorus rising to an almost unbearable volume. It was sensory overload. The pounding hooves, the overwhelming frog calls, the sheer panic. The 3 of them whipped around, expecting to see something charging at them. A stampede, a cavalry, something. But no, there was nothing. Just the thick, eerie fog creeping along the road, undisturbed. No horses, no people, no explanation. Shaken, they turned back to the church, desperate to make sense of what they had just seen and heard. But now, the 6 hooded figures? Gone. Completely vanished. The once empty church was, again, just an empty ruin. The sudden realization hit all 3 of them at the same time. Whatever those things were, they weren't inside the church anymore. And an even more chilling thought crept in. They might be outside, somewhere in the fog, coming for them. That was it. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Ana, Sofia, and Jorge bolted. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them, tearing through the fog, out of La Musara, and back to safety. Or at least what they hoped was safety. Enrique was never seen again. Not by Ana, not by his friends, not by anyone. To this day, no one has any idea what happened to him. And here's the thing. It wasn't just Enrique. Over the years, others have vanished in La Musara without a trace, adding to the town's sinister reputation. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's a portal to another world. Whatever the explanation, one thing is certain. When you step into La Musara, you might not step back out.